Chapter 1. Into the Heart of the Jungle. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the dense canopy of the Amazon rainforest. A heavy mist clung to the trees, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the hum of distant insects. For most, the rainforest was a place of mystery, beauty, and danger, but for Elias Walker, it was a final frontier. Elias had always been captivated by the idea of uncovering the unknown. An archaeologist by training, his life had been spent in dusty libraries, poring over ancient texts and scrolls, but nothing excited him more than the prospect of actual discovery. It wasn't the thought of fame or fortune that drove him, but the need to answer the questions history had left behind. There were whispers in the world of archaeology, whispers about a hidden civilization, long forgotten by time, that held the key to unimaginable wealth and wisdom. If Elias could find it, it would change everything. He stood at the edge of the jungle now, the sounds of civilization slowly fading behind him as his expedition team prepared to venture deeper into the wilderness. The mission had been a long time in the making. Months of planning, countless hours of research, and the careful assembly of a team of experts had led to this moment. Yet, despite all the preparation, the journey still felt like a leap into the unknown. The Amazon was as unforgiving as it was enigmatic, and there was no telling what dangers awaited them within its heart. "Ready, Dr. Walker?" asked Maria, a young anthropologist and one of Elias's most trusted team members. Her voice broke through his thoughts as she adjusted her rucksack and checked the map once more. Elias nodded, brushing a strand of damp hair from his forehead. "As ready as we'll ever be." Maria smiled, though there was a hint of apprehension in her eyes. She wasn't as adventurous as Elias, but her fascination with ancient cultures had brought her to this point. The legends of the Emerald Labyrinth, the mystical maze said to be hidden somewhere deep within the Amazon, were what had drawn her to this expedition. The maze was said to be a structure of immense complexity, designed to protect the treasure of a lost civilization from intruders. But no one had ever found it. "What's the plan once we reach the coordinates?" she asked. Elias turned to face her, his face serious. "We follow the map just like we discussed. There's a clearing about a day's trek from here. From there, we'll find the entrance to the maze. We're not just looking for treasure, Maria. We're looking for something that could rewrite history." Maria nodded, her curiosity piqued despite her unease. The journey ahead was uncertain, but she trusted Elias's instincts. The map they were following had been uncovered from a forgotten archive, one that had been dismissed by most experts as a hoax. Yet Elias believed otherwise. The clues were too precise, the descriptions too detailed to ignore. With the team assembled, they plunged into the jungle, the dense foliage quickly swallowing them up. The air grew thick with humidity, the ground beneath their feet soft and treacherous. Every step they took seemed to bring them deeper into the heart of the rainforest, where the very fabric of nature seemed to close in on them. The jungle was alive with sounds, bird calls, the rustle of unseen creatures, the occasional splash of something large moving through the underbrush. Elias led the way, machete in hand, cutting through the thick vines and branches that obstructed their path. Behind him, Maria, along with the rest of the team, followed in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the journey ahead. Nightfall came quickly in the jungle. The vibrant colors of the day faded into the dark, oppressive greens and blacks of the night. The temperature dropped slightly, but the humidity remained relentless. They made camp in a small clearing, lighting a fire and setting up their tents. The stars above were hidden by the thick canopy, but the flickering flames cast long shadows around them. Over dinner, Elias reviewed the map again, tracing the route with his finger. "We'll continue at first light," he said. His voice steady despite the exhaustion creeping into his bones. "The entrance to the maze should be just beyond the river. Tomorrow we get closer." Maria sat across from him, her eyes flicking between the map and Elias. "Do you think we'll actually find it? The maze, I mean." Elias looked up from the map, meeting her gaze. His expression was unreadable, but there was a spark in his eyes that Maria had seen before. A spark that said he believed in something bigger than just the treasure. "I don't know," Elias admitted, "but I have to believe we're close. The legends, they're too consistent. The treasure isn't just gold or jewels. It's something more." Maria nodded, though her skepticism remained. The idea of an ancient, lost civilization was fascinating, but the tales surrounding the Emerald Labyrinth were almost too fantastical to be true. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something to Elias's certainty. As the fire crackled and the jungle hummed with life, the team settled in for the night. The journey ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but they were all committed to seeing it through. Tomorrow they would take the next step into the unknown, guided by the ancient map, the weight of history on their shoulders. Elias lay awake long after the others had fallen asleep, staring up at the distant stars that barely filtered through the thick trees. He could feel the pull of the jungle, the sense that something ancient and powerful lay hidden just beyond their reach. The Emerald Labyrinth was real, it had to be, and he was going to find it. The adventure had only just begun. Chapter 2: Whispers of the Past. The dense foliage of the Amazon pressed in around them as the expedition pressed forward, the scent of damp earth mingling with the faint, tangy sweetness of blooming flowers. The thick air was a constant reminder that they were far from civilization, swallowed up by the vast, untamed heart of the jungle. As they moved deeper, the sounds of wildlife grew louder, though it was hard to discern whether it was comforting or unsettling. Every now and then, Elias would pause, studying the trees, the ground, the subtle changes in the landscape. He had an uncanny sense of direction in this maze of green, his mind mapping out the coordinates from the ancient map as if they were a part of him. "Do you think we're close?" Maria asked, her voice soft but edged with excitement. Elias glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the path ahead. "We're getting there. According to the map, the river should be just beyond these trees. Once we cross it, we'll be in the vicinity of the maze." The team continued in silence, the weight of the journey slowly settling on their shoulders. The dense jungle, though beautiful, was demanding, testing their endurance. Hours seemed to stretch into eternity as they trudged through the humid air, cutting through the thick underbrush, crossing shallow streams, and maneuvering around the ever-present thorns and vines. By midday, the sun had burned away much of the morning mist, though the air remained thick with humidity. Sweat clung to their clothes, and despite their best efforts to stay hydrated, the oppressive heat began to take its toll. Elias called for a brief halt, and the team gathered in a small clearing where they could rest and replenish their water supplies. "You all right?" Elias asked Maria, who had been walking quietly behind him for the past hour. Maria wiped her forehead, her face flushed from the heat. "I'm fine. Just hoping we're really heading in the right direction. It's hard to imagine anything like a labyrinth existing out here." Elias smiled, though there was a distant look in his eyes. "You'd be surprised what the jungle hides. It's a place that holds secrets, ancient ones. The indigenous tribes that lived here knew things about this land that modern scholars can only guess at. If the maze exists, it's been hidden for centuries. But there's always been something different about this place. The way the trees grow, the patterns in the river. It feels like it's all leading us somewhere." Maria looked around at the towering trees and the thick green walls of vegetation. "It doesn't feel like it's leading anywhere, Elias. It just feels overwhelming." "I know," Elias replied, the edge of his voice softening. "But that's what makes the discovery so important. This is a place where history was buried, hidden, and forgotten. What we're about to find could change everything." The conversation hung in the air for a moment as the team took a moment to eat and drink, the buzz of insects filling the space. Elias could see the doubt in Maria's eyes, the uncertainty that came from venturing into the unknown. But he couldn't afford to let that doubt settle in his mind. This was what he had spent years preparing for, and he couldn't turn back now. The break was short-lived, and after a quick stretch and a check of their gear, they pressed forward again, following Elias as he led them through the jungle. The air grew hotter as they neared the river, and the sound of rushing water became more pronounced. By late afternoon, they arrived at the edge of the river, its wide, fast-moving current cutting through the landscape like a silver ribbon. The water was murky, swirling with the debris carried from upstream. It was a natural barrier, one that would make their passage more difficult, but not impossible. "There it is," Elias murmured, his eyes gleaming with the familiar spark of determination. He knelt by the riverbank, inspecting the water. "We need to cross, but we'll have to be careful. The current is stronger than it looks." One by one, they made their way to the river's edge. Elias took the lead, using a rope to help the team cross, guiding them carefully across the slippery rocks and into the fast-moving water. The river's power was undeniable, and as Elias gripped the rope, he felt a momentary hesitation, a sense that they were crossing into a world that would no longer be governed by the rules of the ordinary. The water was cold, but it didn't numb the excitement building in Elias's chest. This was it. They were crossing into the heart of the jungle, closer than ever to the Emerald Labyrinth. Once they were all safely across, the jungle on the other side felt different. The trees were larger here, their trunks thick and gnarled, reaching toward the sky as though they were ancient sentinels standing guard over something far more significant than mere plant life. The air was heavier, charged with an unseen energy. "This feels wrong," Maria whispered, her voice low. "It doesn't feel natural." Elias turned to look at her, sensing the tension in her words. "I know, but it's the maze. We're close." The team pressed on, moving through the dense forest with renewed focus. The path was narrow here, winding through thick underbrush and twisted roots, and the sounds of the jungle seemed to grow quieter as they ventured deeper. The only sounds now were the crunching of leaves beneath their feet and the occasional rustle of distant creatures in the trees above. As dusk settled in, Elias paused once more, studying the terrain ahead. The dense trees began to thin, and he could see what looked like a large stone formation in the distance, an unusual structure in the midst of the natural jungle. "Everyone stay close," Elias instructed, his voice firm. "We're almost there." They approached the stone formation cautiously, their eyes scanning for any signs of danger. The stones were weathered, covered in moss and vines, but there was no mistaking the craftsmanship. This was no natural rock formation. This was something constructed, something ancient. Maria stepped forward, running her fingers lightly over the stones. "It's incredible," she whispered. "This could be part of the maze." Elias nodded, a sense of awe creeping into his voice. "We've found it, the entrance to the Emerald Labyrinth." But as the team gathered around the stones, a strange feeling crept over them. The air grew colder, the jungle around them silent, as though holding its breath. The entrance to the maze was before them, but they were no longer certain if it was the labyrinth that awaited them, or something far darker, and as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Elias felt the weight of the jungle pressing in on him. The maze wasn't just a relic of the past, it was a warning. Chapter 3: The First Passage. The jungle had fallen eerily silent as they stood before the entrance to the Emerald Labyrinth. It was a stone structure, weathered by centuries of neglect, but its purpose was unmistakable. Covered in vines and moss, the jagged edges of the stone seemed to hum with an ancient energy, as if the very rocks were alive, waiting for something or someone to awaken them. Elias ran his hand along the cold, uneven surface, his fingers tracing symbols carved deep into the stone. He couldn't help but feel a sense of reverence, as if he were standing in front of a sacred gate, a threshold between two worlds. "I think we're here," Elias murmured, barely above a whisper, as though speaking too loudly would disturb the labyrinth's slumber. Maria stepped forward, her face a mixture of awe and trepidation. "It's real," she said, the words slipping from her lips as though she herself couldn't believe it. "I never thought. I mean, the legends didn't do this justice." The others stood in silence, gazing at the imposing structure, unsure of what to expect next. There was an undeniable weight to the air now, an unseen pressure that made it difficult to breathe, as if the very earth around them was holding its breath. Elias turned back to face his team, his eyes sharp and calculating. "We need to stay focused. This isn't just an archaeological discovery. It's a journey into something far older than any of us could have imagined." He gestured toward the entrance, a narrow opening flanked by two towering stone columns. The darkness beyond it seemed to swallow up the light, creating an unsettling void. Despite the fear that gnawed at him, Elias knew this was their path forward. "Stay close," he ordered. "We don't know what lies beyond." One by one, the team stepped forward, following Elias into the narrow passageway. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp earth and ancient stone, and the temperature dropped noticeably as they ventured deeper. The walls of the tunnel seemed to close in around them, the faint glow of their torches casting flickering shadows against the cold stone. The path was uneven, forcing them to step carefully over rocks and rubble that had accumulated over centuries of neglect. Elias led the way, his hand constantly brushing against the walls, seeking any clue, any sign that they were on the right path. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the sound of their footsteps echoing off the walls. There was no sign of the treasure they had expected, no immediate indication that they were on the brink of discovering something monumental. It was as though the labyrinth had been waiting, dormant and patient, for the right moment to reveal itself. "How long do you think this tunnel goes on for?" Maria asked, her voice a little shaky as she looked around at the dark passage ahead. Elias paused, glancing back at her. "Hard to say. The map didn't give many details. But if it's anything like the legends say, this place is massive. It could be miles underground." The group continued moving forward, the air growing colder with every step. The walls of the tunnel were adorned with carvings, faded and worn by time, but still discernible. They depicted scenes of an ancient civilization, people in ceremonial attire, elaborate structures, and symbols that seemed to tell stories of gods and spirits. Each image was a puzzle, each carving a fragment of a long-lost history. "There's so much here," Maria murmured, her fingers brushing over the carvings as she tried to make sense of them. "I can't even begin to interpret these." Elias stopped and turned to her, his expression serious. "Don't get lost in the details. We need to keep moving. This place could change at any moment." As if on cue, the ground beneath them shifted. There was a low rumble like distant thunder, and a tremor ran through the tunnel. The walls creaked, and the stones underfoot groaned in protest. The team froze, fear gripping their hearts as they instinctively looked around, unsure of what was happening. "What was that?" one of the team members, Alex, whispered. Elias raised a hand, signaling for silence. The rumble subsided as quickly as it had started, and the oppressive stillness returned. He glanced around, his instincts on high alert. "It's nothing, just the instability of the place. These structures are old and the earth around us is shifting. Let's keep moving." Though his words were meant to reassure, they did little to calm the unease in the air. The team pressed on, though now they moved with a greater sense of caution. The deeper they ventured into the labyrinth, the more the walls seemed to close in. The passageway was narrow, and their torchlight flickered in the still air, casting long stretching shadows that seemed to shift with their movements. After what felt like an eternity of winding corridors and low arches, the group reached a large chamber. The air was heavier here, the temperature noticeably colder. The chamber was vast, its ceiling lost in the darkness above, and the floor was scattered with stones and debris. In the center of the room stood a stone pedestal, and atop it, a gleaming emerald artifact, shaped like a twisted vine, its edges sharp and jagged. Almost alive with an inner light, Elias stepped forward, his breath catching as he beheld the artifact. "This is it," he breathed. "The first clue. The treasure? Or perhaps a key to something even more significant." The team gathered around the pedestal, eyes wide with awe. The emerald was unlike anything they had ever seen, its surface smooth and polished, glowing faintly in the dim light of their torches. But even as they marveled at the object, a feeling of unease settled over them. The silence in the chamber seemed to stretch, pressing in on them from all sides. Suddenly, there was a low, resonating sound, a hum that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The ground beneath them trembled once more, and the air became charged with an almost palpable energy. The labyrinth was waking up. "Elias, what's happening?" Maria asked, her voice tight with fear. Elias's gaze was fixed on the pedestal, his mind racing. I don't know, but we need to leave. Now. But as they turned to retreat, the entrance they had come through vanished. The walls of the chamber began to shift, stone grinding against stone, and the labyrinth itself seemed to close them in. The first passage had opened the door to something far greater and far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. The maze was alive and it was testing them. Chapter 4. The Shifting Maze. The walls groaned and shifted, the stone grinding against stone with an unnatural grinding sound. Panic began to creep in, its cold fingers clawing at the edges of Elias's mind. His heart hammered in his chest as he turned toward the now sealed entrance. What had been an open path moments ago was now a solid wall of stone, impenetrable and unyielding. "Stay calm," Elias shouted, his voice cutting through the rising tension. "We can't panic. This is part of it. We're in the labyrinth now. We need to think clearly." The team gathered together, each person looking from one to the other, unsure of what to do next. The hum that had filled the air was now a low thrum beneath their feet, as if the very ground itself was alive and breathing. The room felt as though it were closing in around them, suffocating them in a strange, alien energy. Maria, her face pale, stepped closer to Elias. "What's happening? Is this some kind of defense mechanism? Is the labyrinth reacting to our presence?" Elias nodded, his mind racing. "It must be." The legend spoke of the maze as though it had a consciousness of its own. It wasn't just a structure. It was a living thing designed to protect what lies within. Alex, who had been standing a few feet away, suddenly spoke up. "Then what do we do now? Do we go back? There's no way to open that entrance and—" He cut himself off as the ground trembled again, a deep, shuddering vibration that rattled their teeth. "No one's going anywhere," Elias said firmly, his voice steady despite the rising panic in the others. "We've come too far. We need to find another way out, but we also need to stay focused. This labyrinth is designed to challenge us. If we let it get in our heads, we won't make it." Maria, still gripping her pack tightly, scanned the room. "We can't just stand here. There must be another way through. Something in this room could give us a clue. Look around." The team spread out, each member's flashlight illuminating a different part of the vast chamber. The stone pedestal remained at the center, the emerald still glowing faintly atop it. The hum continued to pulse beneath their feet, but it wasn't just the pedestal that seemed to be pulsing now. The walls, the floors, and even the ceiling seemed to have a rhythm of their own, as though they were all part of a larger system. Elias approached the pedestal, his mind racing. This has to be more than just a treasure. It's the key to the next phase of the maze. We need to figure out how it works." Maria stepped beside him, her eyes scanning the pedestal's intricate carvings. "There's something familiar about these patterns. They remind me of the symbols we saw in the tunnel earlier." Elias nodded, his hand hovering over the emerald. The closer he got to it, the stronger the hum became. It was almost as if the stone were alive, thrumming with power. Slowly, he extended his hand and brushed his fingers against the cool surface. The moment his skin made contact with the emerald, the chamber seemed to come alive. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the air like an electric current. The ground beneath their feet shifted again, this time with a violent jolt that sent everyone stumbling. The walls creaked and groaned, and the stone floor began to crack open in places. The emerald pulsed in Elias's hand, its glow intensifying, until with a sharp crack, the pedestal split in half, revealing a hidden passage below. A dark, narrow tunnel stretched downward into the unknown, its depths hidden by shadow. "Elias, what did you do?" Maria gasped, her voice trembling. "I didn't do anything," Elias replied, pulling his hand back quickly. "It reacted to me. The emerald, whatever it is, has activated something." The group huddled together, the chamber now eerily silent except for the distant hum of the labyrinth's pulse. They could see nothing but the narrow tunnel ahead. But there was no turning back now. Elias's heart raced as he looked down the passage. The emerald's glow illuminated the walls just enough for them to see that the tunnel was smooth, expertly carved, almost too perfect to be natural. "We go through," Elias said, his voice steady once again. "We've come this far, and the only way out is forward." The team nodded, their expressions a mixture of fear and determination. They had no other choice but to follow the path the labyrinth had set for them. One by one, they descended into the tunnel. The walls seemed to close in tighter as they moved further down, the air growing colder with each step. The further they went, the more the energy in the tunnel seemed to intensify, as though they were descending into the very heart of the labyrinth. Maria shivered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Elias, do you feel that? It's like the walls are watching us." "I know," Elias muttered, though his eyes were fixed ahead. "It's like the maze is alive, and it doesn't want us here." The further they descended, the more the tunnel seemed to stretch on endlessly. Time lost all meaning in the cold darkness, and the only thing that mattered was the steady, rhythmic pulse of the emerald, leading them deeper and deeper into the maze. Suddenly, the tunnel opened up into another chamber, much smaller than the last but equally as strange. The walls were adorned with more carvings, but this time, the symbols were different, more intricate, more elaborate. At the center of the room stood another pedestal, though this one was not empty. A large ornate key rested upon it, surrounded by strange markings that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. "This is it," Elias whispered, his eyes locked on the key. "This must be the next piece." Maria stepped forward, her voice barely a whisper. "But what does it unlock? And why is it so important?" Elias approached the pedestal slowly, careful not to disturb the ancient markings that surrounded it. "I don't know, but we have to take it. Whatever the labyrinth is hiding, we're getting closer." But as he reached out to grab the key, the ground trembled once more, and the air seemed to crackle with an unnatural energy. The walls of the chamber began to shift again, and the key glowed brighter, its light now blinding in its intensity. Something was wrong. Elias's hand froze just inches from the key as a voice, low, ancient, and full of menace, whispered from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come." The air turned ice cold, and the labyrinth seemed to close in around them, its pulse quickening as though it were preparing to consume them whole. The real test was only beginning, and the emerald labyrinth was not ready to let them go. Chapter 5: The Guardian's Challenge. The voice echoed through the chamber, cold and ominous, sending a wave of dread rippling through the group. Elias's hand hovered just above the key, But the words, so ancient, so full of warning, halted him in his tracks. His heart raced, and the oppressive silence in the chamber seemed to press down on them like an invisible weight. "You shouldn't have come." The words were clear, as though they had been spoken directly into his mind, their meaning simple yet terrifying. For a moment the room seemed to stretch, the walls bending in unnatural ways, and the light from their torches flickered in a chaotic dance. The floor beneath their feet trembled, and the stone pedestal groaned as though it were alive. Maria gasped, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that? What was that voice?" Elias took a step back from the pedestal, his mind racing. The legends had spoken of the labyrinth's power, its ability to test those who entered, but nothing had prepared them for this. Whatever lay ahead, whatever force governed the labyrinth, it was watching them, and it was not pleased. "I think it's a warning," Elias said quietly, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "We need to be careful. This isn't just a physical journey. This place is alive, more than we thought." Suddenly, the room seemed to contract further, the walls shifting and creaking, and in the center of the chamber, the light from the key began to pulse with a rhythm that mirrored the thrum of the labyrinth itself. As the pulsations grew stronger, a shadow began to form, coalescing into a figure, a tall, imposing figure made entirely of the same green stone as the labyrinth walls. The figure's face was a mask of smooth stone, its features expressionless but somehow menacing. The figure's eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed with an eerie, otherworldly light, and a low hum filled the air, vibrating through the stones. Elias's breath caught in his throat. This was no mere decoration. This was the guardian of the labyrinth. "Who dares to disturb the sanctum?" The guardian's voice boomed, its deep, resonating tone echoing through the chamber. It was as though the very stone was speaking, its voice born from the heart of the maze itself. We came to find the treasure," Elias said, his voice strong but betraying a hint of hesitation. "The forgotten civilization's legacy." The guardian tilted its head slightly, the stone face never changing, but the air around them thickened with an almost palpable sense of danger. "The treasure is not for the taking," it replied coldly. "The maze exists to protect that which was meant to remain hidden. Only those who prove themselves worthy may pass." The stone figure raised its hand, and suddenly the chamber shifted. The walls cracked open, revealing a narrow, winding corridor that seemed to stretch infinitely into darkness. The floor beneath their feet rumbled as if a great weight had been lifted, and the air was filled with the faint sound of something moving, something unseen. "The challenge begins now," the guardian declared. "Survive the trials and you may proceed. Fail, and you will remain here forever." The guardian stepped back, its form dissolving into the shadows from which it had emerged. The room, now eerily quiet, was left with only the pulsing glow of the emerald key, which seemed to draw their attention once again. Despite the terror that hung thick in the air, Elias knew that the key was the next step. But what would it unlock? "We have to go," Elias said firmly, looking back at his team. His voice left no room for argument. The labyrinth had made its intentions clear, and there was no turning back now. Maria nodded, her eyes wide but determined. "We're ready." Without another word, the team moved toward the narrow corridor that had appeared in place of the chamber. The walls seemed to close in behind them as they entered, the passage barely wide enough for them to walk side by side. The air grew thick and their torches flickered, casting elongated shadows that danced eerily along the stone walls. As they made their way down the passage, the temperature dropped, and the air became dense with an unsettling silence. They walked in tense formation, each member focused on the path ahead, but the uncertainty of what awaited them gnawed at their minds. After a few minutes, the corridor opened into another chamber, this one unlike any they had encountered before. The floor was covered in smooth stone tiles, each etched with symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. At the center of the room, a pedestal stood, this one bearing a large ornate door key made of gold and inlaid with gemstones. "This must be the key to the next door," Elias said, stepping forward cautiously. He reached out to take the key, but before his fingers could make contact, the ground beneath them began to tremble violently. "Get back!" Maria shouted, pulling Elias away just as the floor shifted. The tiles began to slide, moving like a puzzle, some rising, others sinking into the ground. A sudden crash of stone echoed through the chamber as large stone columns shot up from the floor, surrounding them in a ring. "Move!" Elias yelled, grabbing Maria's arm and pulling her toward one of the columns for cover. The other team members scattered, seeking refuge behind the rising structures. The room was transforming, shifting in front of their eyes, the tiles and columns rearranging themselves into an intricate pattern. The walls seemed to close in, and the air grew colder, heavy with the oppressive weight of the labyrinth's will. "This isn't just a maze," Alex gasped, looking around frantically as the room continued to shift. "It's alive. It's testing us." Elias nodded grimly. "We have to complete the puzzle. We have to move with the room's changes, not against them." The columns rose and fell in an unpredictable rhythm, and the tiles shifted, forming a pathway toward the center of the room where the golden key rested on its pedestal. The group watched in stunned silence as the room continued its dance, each movement part of a larger, intricate system. Their every step was crucial now. One wrong move and they would be trapped. Together, they moved carefully, timing their steps to the rising and falling columns, navigating the shifting tiles as if the labyrinth itself were testing their resolve. It was a dance of patience, of calculation, and of trust. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Elias reached the pedestal and grabbed the golden key. As soon as his fingers closed around it, the room froze, the shifting stones halting in place. The columns returned to the floor, and the tiles slid back into their original positions. The air, once thick with tension, cleared, and the oppressive feeling of being watched lifted slightly. "We've passed the first test," Elias said, breathing a sigh of relief, though his heart still pounded in his chest. He turned toward his team, holding the key aloft. "Now let's get to the next challenge." But they all knew one thing. The labyrinth was far from done with them. What lay ahead would be even more perilous, and they had no way of knowing what the maze would demand next. Chapter 6. The Echoes of Time. The golden key felt strangely warm in Elias's hand, as though it had been waiting for him to claim it for an eternity. He stared at it for a long moment, the gemstone eyes of the labyrinth's guardian still vivid in his mind. The key was no longer just an object of treasure. It had become a symbol of something far greater, an artifact of immense power. But its true purpose remained a mystery. They moved cautiously toward the exit of the chamber, the walls humming faintly as though the labyrinth itself was alive and aware of their every step. The air was thick, the oppressive weight of time pressing down on them as if the very walls carried the memories of centuries. Elias took the lead, his thoughts focused on the key. What had the Guardian meant when it said the labyrinth had to be proven worthy? What did that truly entail? He glanced back at his team, whose faces were etched with both determination and fear. They had all changed since entering the maze. None of them were the same as when they had first crossed the threshold, drawn by the promise of riches and discovery. Now they were a team bound by a singular goal: survival. The narrow passage ahead wound downward, leading them deeper into the heart of the labyrinth. As they descended, the temperature dropped, and the flickering light of their torches cast long shadows on the walls. The darkness pressed in, making every step feel more uncertain than the last. Finally, they reached another chamber, a vast cavern filled with a strange, otherworldly glow. The walls were smooth and polished, adorned with intricate carvings that seemed to shimmer and move as if they were alive. At the center of the room, a massive stone archway loomed, its surface covered in strange, glowing runes. The archway beckoned them forward, as though it were a gateway to another world. Maria stepped forward, her breath catching in her throat. "What is this place?" she whispered. Elias stepped up beside her, eyeing the archway warily. "This is what we've been searching for. The next step." But even as he spoke, something felt wrong. The air in the room was heavy with the presence of something ancient, something far older than the stone walls around them. The echoes of time itself seemed to reverberate through the chamber, filling the silence with whispers of long-forgotten secrets. "This place doesn't feel like the rest of the maze," Alex said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's different." "I agree," Elias murmured. "The labyrinth has a mind of its own, and I think it's testing us, pushing us further. But this isn't just about treasure. Whatever lies beyond that archway, it's not something we can face blindly." There was a faint, almost imperceptible hum coming from the archway. It was soft at first, like a distant murmur, but it grew louder as they approached. The runes on the archway pulsed with a rhythmic energy, and the floor beneath their feet vibrated, as though the entire cavern was alive and responding to their presence. "Elias," Maria said, her voice tense. "What are those runes? They're familiar. I've seen them before." Elias looked closely at the symbols etched into the stone. They were complex but not entirely foreign. The symbols seemed to correspond to a language he had seen in his research, the ancient script of the civilization they were seeking. The same civilization whose treasure they were attempting to uncover. "This is it," Elias said, his voice low but filled with certainty. "These are the symbols of the forgotten civilization, the ones that built this maze. And those runes, they're a warning." "A warning?" Maria asked, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" Elias stared at the archway, his mind racing. "The warning is clear. This is no ordinary doorway. It's a portal, one that leads into something far beyond the physical realm. I think it's a trial, a test of the mind, not just the body." Before anyone could respond, the hum from the archway reached a deafening pitch, and the runes flared with light. The ground beneath their feet shook violently, and the very air seemed to vibrate with an energy so powerful that it made their bones ache. In an instant, the archway erupted with a blinding light, and before they could react, the world around them seemed to dissolve. Elias felt as though he were being torn from his body, his senses overwhelmed by the intensity of the light and the vibrations that coursed through his every cell. The world blurred, and for a moment he lost all sense of time and space. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The blinding light faded, and the world around them returned to focus. They were no longer in the cavern. Elias staggered, disoriented, his breath coming in short gasps as he tried to steady himself. The ground beneath him was soft, almost like sand, but it wasn't sand. He looked around, his eyes adjusting to the new environment. They were in a vast open space, an endless desert stretching out before them, its landscape eerily still and silent. "What the hell just happened?" Alex whispered, his voice shaky. "Where are we?" Elias could barely make sense of the scene in front of him. The sky above was a dark, swirling mass of clouds, and the wind howled across the barren landscape. In the distance, he could see the faint outline of what appeared to be a city, ancient, crumbling structures half buried in the sand. "This isn't part of the labyrinth," Elias said, his voice tight with disbelief. "We've crossed into something else. Some kind of another plane of existence." Maria's eyes were wide with fear. Is this what the labyrinth has been hiding? The true treasure?" "No," Elias said, shaking his head slowly. "This is a trial. The labyrinth wasn't just protecting the treasure. It was protecting something else. Something far more dangerous." He looked around, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of their surroundings. This place was unlike anything they had encountered before. The air felt thick with the weight of centuries, as though they had stepped into a moment frozen in time. "We need to be careful," Elias said, his voice steady but filled with caution. "Whatever this place is, it's part of the labyrinth's final challenge. We've crossed into a realm where the rules don't apply the same way. And whatever waits for us here, it won't be what we expect." As they stepped forward into the desert, the sound of their footsteps seemed to echo in the silence, and the strange, oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on their shoulders. They had no choice but to move forward, for there was nowhere else to go. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the ruins, they knew the next trial awaited them. Whatever the labyrinth had in store, they would have to face it together. Chapter 7: The Desert of Lost Souls. The desolate desert stretched out endlessly before them, a vast ocean of swirling sand and ancient ruins. The wind howled, carrying with it the faint scent of decay, and the sky overhead remained a dark, swirling mass of clouds. Elias could feel the weight of the place pressing down on them, a sense of timelessness, as though they had stepped into a forgotten world where the rules of reality no longer held sway. "We need to move," Elias said, his voice breaking the heavy silence that had settled around them. "There's no telling how long we'll be here, but we can't stay still." The others nodded, though their faces were etched with uncertainty. The desert had an oppressive, unnatural stillness, as though it were holding its breath. Each step they took seemed to sink slightly into the sand, and the air was thick with an ancient energy that made the hairs on the back of Elias's neck stand on end. Maria walked beside him, her gaze fixed on the distant ruins. "What do you think this place is?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Is it part of the labyrinth? Some sort of memory?" "I don't know," Elias admitted, his eyes scanning the horizon. "It feels like we've stepped into another time, another reality maybe, but the labyrinth, it's manipulating us. It's forcing us to face something more than just physical challenges." They walked in silence for a few moments, the sound of their footsteps the only thing breaking the eerie quiet of the desert. In the distance, the ruins loomed larger, their ancient stone structures half buried in sand, as though they had been abandoned for centuries. There was something unsettling about them, an aura of decay and loss that seemed to radiate from the crumbling walls. Suddenly, a low, mournful sound broke through the silence, a distant, echoing cry that seemed to come from deep within the ruins. Elias froze, his heart racing as he tried to pinpoint the source of the sound. It was a voice, human but distorted and pained, as though it were trapped in time. "What was that?" Alex asked, his voice tight with fear. "Did you hear it?" Elias nodded grimly. "We're not alone here." Maria stepped closer to Elias, her eyes wide with fear. "Should we go toward it?" Elias hesitated, his gaze fixed on the ruins. The sound seemed to call to them, but at the same time it felt wrong, like a trap, a lure to draw them deeper into the heart of this strange desert. He had a feeling that whatever awaited them in those ruins was no ordinary danger. It was something ancient, something tied to the very fabric of the labyrinth. "We have no choice," he said finally. "We need to find out what's going on, but we'll stay cautious." The group moved toward the ruins, the sand shifting beneath their feet with each step. The wind picked up, swirling around them in sudden gusts that threatened to throw them off balance. As they neared the entrance to the first structure, the eerie cry grew louder, almost deafening but still distant. It was like an echo that had been repeating for centuries, calling them to a place they could not yet understand. They stepped into the ruins, the air inside cooler and heavier. The walls were adorned with strange carvings and symbols, much like the ones they had seen in the labyrinth itself. The designs were familiar, yet alien, as though they were trying to communicate something beyond their comprehension. Some of the symbols seemed to shift in the dim light, as though they were alive, moving with an intention all their own. "Stay close," Elias whispered, his hand gripping the hilt of his machete. "Whatever's in here, we need to stay together." They ventured deeper into the ruins, the narrow passages growing darker and more oppressive as they moved. The cries they had heard earlier grew louder, now almost deafening, as though the very walls were filled with the voices of the past, the tortured souls of those who had once lived here. And then they came upon the source. In the center of the ruined structure, a large stone altar stood, its surface covered in ancient glyphs. The air around it shimmered, as though reality itself was warping. Elias stepped forward, his breath catching in his throat as he saw the figure kneeling at the altar. It was a woman, or at least it appeared to be. Her form was translucent, her features blurred and indistinct, as though she were trapped between worlds. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and her head was bowed in an eternal prayer, her mouth moving as though she were speaking words that had been lost to time. The cries they had heard earlier were emanating from her, her voice trapped in an endless loop, a torment that had lasted for centuries. Maria gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Is she alive? Elias shook his head. No, she's a memory, a soul trapped in this place. They stood frozen, watching the apparition before them. Elias felt a chill run through his body, a coldness that seemed to seep into his very bones. The woman's gaze shifted toward them, her eyes empty and hollow, but there was something in them, something that sent a shiver of dread down Elias's spine. Then she spoke. "Leave this place," her voice whispered, a soft, mournful plea. "Do not disturb what lies beneath." Her words echoed through the ruins, reverberating off the stone walls like a warning. But the tone was not one of anger. It was the voice of someone who had long since resigned herself to her fate, someone who had been lost to time and torment. Elias stepped forward cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. "What is this place? Why are you here?" The woman's form flickered, and for a brief moment, her face seemed to become clear, familiar even. She looked like someone Elias had seen before, someone from his dreams, from his research. He couldn't place her name, but he knew that this was no coincidence. "I was a part of this civilization," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I was the last to fall, the last to be trapped in this place. The labyrinth. It is not just a test. It is a prison. A prison for those who sought the treasure, but failed to understand its true nature." The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the air seemed to grow thick with a strange energy. The woman's form began to distort, her figure flickering like a flame in the wind. Elias's heart skipped a beat. "You must leave," she repeated, her voice growing fainter. "The labyrinth will consume you, unless you prove worthy." With that, her form collapsed into a swirl of sand and dust, vanishing into the ruins. For a moment, the group stood in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed. The eerie cries faded into the distance, and the atmosphere in the ruins seemed to grow even heavier. Elias exhaled slowly, his mind reeling. "This is a warning. The labyrinth is not just a test of skill. It's a test of the soul." Maria's voice trembled. "What do we do now?" "We continue," Elias said firmly. "But we need to be prepared. The labyrinth isn't just trying to keep us out. It's trying to change us. And we need to be stronger than it if we're going to survive." With that, they turned and moved deeper into the ruins, knowing that the real challenge was only beginning. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, no matter what the labyrinth threw at them. Chapter 8. The Heart of the Maze. The desert had given way to ruins, and the ruins to deeper, darker passageways. The labyrinth, in all its mysterious and ancient grandeur, seemed endless, as though it existed outside the bounds of time itself. Yet now, after everything they had faced, every challenge, every trial, it was time for them to reach the heart of the maze. Elias could feel it in his bones. The final step was near. They had come this far. Elias and his team pressed on through the twisting corridors, the oppressive air thick with the ancient power of the labyrinth. The walls seemed to close in on them as they descended into a vast underground chamber. The air was stifling here, the ground damp with the moisture of centuries-old secrets buried deep beneath the earth. In the center of the chamber stood a towering stone structure, an altar, much like the one they had seen before, but this one was unlike anything they had encountered. It was covered in shimmering emerald runes that pulsed with an otherworldly light. The very air around it seemed to hum with energy, the power radiating from the structure like a living force. Elias stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. This was it, the heart of the labyrinth. The treasure they had come to find, the key to an ancient civilization's forgotten power, lay right in front of them. But something felt wrong. The air around the altar was thick with tension, and the ground beneath their feet trembled as if the labyrinth itself was alive. Waiting, Maria stepped up beside him, her voice barely a whisper. "Is this it? Is this the treasure?" Elias nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the altar. "It's not just treasure. It's the heart of this place. The power that has kept the labyrinth alive all these centuries. But it comes with a price." They approached cautiously, each step echoing through the chamber like a death knell. The runes on the altar seemed to react to their presence, flickering and shifting in a mesmerizing pattern. Elias reached out a hand, his fingers brushing against the stone. The moment he made contact, the ground shook violently. The walls around them groaned and cracked as if the entire chamber were collapsing inward. A deep, rumbling voice echoed through the chamber, reverberating off the stone walls and shaking the very foundation of the labyrinth. "You have come far," the voice boomed, ancient and filled with sorrow. "But this is where your journey ends." Elias's heart pounded in his chest as he pulled his hand back from the altar. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What is this place?" The voice did not answer immediately, but the air around them grew colder, the temperature dropping sharply. It was as if time itself was slowing down. The walls seemed to close in, the labyrinth pulling them into its grasp. This place, the voice finally spoke, was built as a test, a trial for those who sought to uncover the secrets of the ancient civilization that once lived here. But the labyrinth was never meant to be a treasure trove. It was a prison for the souls who sought power without understanding the cost. The walls of the chamber began to glow with a faint green light, illuminating a figure that slowly emerged from the shadows. It was the woman they had seen in the ruins, the one who had warned them. "You have proven yourselves worthy of this knowledge," she said, her voice sorrowful yet filled with an ancient wisdom. "But you have also come too far. The labyrinth was not meant to be opened, and now you must decide: leave and never return, or accept the price and claim the power of the heart." Elias's mind raced. He had come to find treasure, riches, glory. But now, standing before the truth, the weight of the labyrinth's history pressed down on him like an iron vice. This was no simple quest for gold. This was something far more dangerous, something far more profound. "We don't want power," Elias said firmly. "We came to learn, to uncover the truth of this place. But we can't take it with us. We can't." "You misunderstand," the woman interrupted, her figure flickering like a flame in the wind. "The labyrinth's heart is not just a treasure. It is the soul of the civilization that built this place. It is their knowledge, their power, their downfall. You must choose. Take it and risk becoming part of the labyrinth's endless cycle. Or leave and never speak of what you have seen here." The ground shook again, more violently this time, as if the labyrinth itself was reacting to their indecision. "I won't let this place trap us," Elias said, his voice steady. "We came for knowledge, not power. We will leave." Maria and Alex stood beside him, their faces set with determination. They had seen enough of the labyrinth's tricks, its trials, and its dangers. They knew they had come too far to fall victim to its allure. With one last glance at the altar, Elias turned away, signaling for the others to follow. As they walked back toward the entrance of the chamber, the labyrinth seemed to stir, the walls groaning as though in protest. But Elias held firm. They passed through the corridors, the echoes of their footsteps fading as they moved away from the heart of the maze. The oppressive air seemed to lift, and the labyrinth's grip loosened with each step they took as they emerged from the depths. The light of the outside world greeted them, a stark contrast to the darkness of the labyrinth. The jungle stood before them, untouched by the trials they had faced, and the vast expanse of the Amazon stretched out in all directions. "We made it," Maria said, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Elias looked back at the entrance to the labyrinth, his heart heavy with the knowledge they had uncovered. They had come seeking treasure, but instead they had found something far more valuable: the truth. The labyrinth was a prison, a test for those who sought power without understanding the cost. And they had passed the test, leaving with their souls intact as they disappeared into the jungle. Elias couldn't shake the feeling that the labyrinth's heart still pulsed somewhere deep within the earth, its ancient power waiting for the next soul brave enough to seek it. But for now they were free, and that was enough.